Whatever time it is, wherever you are that you're watching today, thanks for making us a part of your life. My name's Rachel, and I'm glad you're here with us. Today we're on part 2 out of a 6-part series called You're Not the Boss of Me. And the subtitle really sets the tone for what we talked about last week and what we'll talk about the rest of this series. This 6-part series. Say it with me. How to say no to the emotions that compete for control. Now, if you're not saying that randomly throughout your day after this series is over, then we're doing something wrong. Now, if you missed last week, that kind of sucks, because how is today's video going to make any sense if you haven't seen last week's video? You're going to want to go watch last week's video. You see, all these messages all build on each other, and you can't have one without the other. So hit pause right now, go invest about 20 minutes and catch up. You'll thank me later. Oh, and you'll be glad you did it too, because, well, good. Today, however, we're moving on, and we're going to start talking about one of these emotions that lurk within us and how it affects our hearts. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Before we do, sit back, strap in, keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times. Basically, just pretend you're in a roller coaster. And let's get the drop on what's happening with Bridge Church.
Yeah, we are in the place to be.
What's up? My name's Zach, and you're about to get El Drop. The best part of school. But, I'm really glad you're watching this video, but there are more important things. We want to see everybody in a circle. Join us on Sunday at 4 p.m. for a circle in the park. Meet us at the Delco Park Shelters for some real talk about the message. But do not forget, starting Sunday, September 6th, we'll be moving to my house at 4 p.m. Just be sweet with it. No one even says that. School is starting this week. Boom. Can't you tell how excited I am? If there's anything we can help you or your family with, please let us know. All of the ways to reach us can be found on our Facebook page. Yeah, there we go. For more information on what's happening, check out our Facebook page or bridgedayton.com. And now, here's my dad with part 2 of the series, You're Not the Boss of Me.
I like to read Reddit, mostly for funny memes or like obscure scientific research kind of things, but every now and then they have these polls, and once in a while the poll asks a really interesting question. Maybe you've seen these before. Questions, they generally go something like this, and they're really eye-opening. What would you do if you knew you could get away with it? If you knew you could get away with anything, that there'd be no consequences, what would you do? And the answers in these things are scary. I mean, forget about the nice old couple living next door to you, the sweet young family starting their life across the street, that kind lady at the self-checkout line at Kroger. You have no idea what they would do if they knew that they could get away with it. Think about this for yourself. Hit pause if you need to. What would you do if you knew that you could get away with it? Now, here's what we know about other people, and hopefully that we're learning about ourselves. When the external filters are off, when fear of punishment is gone, when we know that we can't get caught, what happens in those moments, and this is what makes it scary, is that our hearts are exposed. All of a sudden we discover what's in there. We just hadn't thought about it, and we probably don't want to think about it again. In fact, when I asked that question a few minutes ago, something terrible possibly came into your mind. You couldn't even stop yourself. It just popped up. And because of our childhood and our culture, and because we're responsible people, We learn to monitor our behavior in order to get jobs and dates and second dates and to be married and to not get divorced. But no one's ever taught us to monitor what's going on in our hearts. And worse than that, our culture many times encourages us to follow our hearts. Well, is that a good idea? I guess it just depends on what's in our hearts. And we learned from what Jesus said last week that the thing that comes out of a person's mouth, those things that we say in unguarded moments and sometimes even in the guarded moments, that they come from the heart. They originate from inside of us. It was already there. Now, if this is all new to you, invest about 20 minutes, like Rachel said. Hit pause here, jump back to last week, and catch up with us. You'll be glad that you did. And here's the ultimate point of all of this stuff. Let me grab something here. This container that I have, shaking this container or tipping this container over, it doesn't determine what comes out of it. What's in this determines what comes out of here. Shaking it or tipping it over just exposes what's already in it. It's the same thing with me, and it's the same thing with you and the people that you are in a relationship with. What comes out of us is in us, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. The bottom line here is that we need to heed Solomon's advice. Solomon was the king of Israel. He was undoubtedly like the wisest king that Israel ever had. He lived long before Jesus, and he made many amazing statements that are all written down in a document called Proverbs. Now, every culture has their Proverbs. Solomon just happened to be the one that wrote the Jewish Proverbs. Here's what he said. Above all else, and this is an extreme statement, he's saying this is the most important thing that you can do. And he talks about so many other things in the Proverbs, but this is the most important thing to do. Guard your heart. And this is the most important because everything you do and say flows from it. So in addition to monitoring our behavior, and we're all pros at that, Solomon and Jesus say that it goes beyond behavior, and we need to monitor our hearts because it's what's in here that will ultimately be out there. Now think about this. What your parents carried in their hearts, it eventually spilled out on each other. And ultimately it spilled out onto you. And as we said last week, what's in your heart will spill out on those who are closest to you. So this is a big deal. Guarding our hearts involves cleaning the toxins out as well as keeping them out of here. Because we've got some gross stuff in our hearts. Most of our hearts aren't full of sweetness like this jar. So I'd like to begin with one particular thing that we all need to know what to do with. In fact, I think we all carry a little bit of this around inside of us. But the question is it the boss of us? Today, I want to talk about guilt, the emotion associated with acknowledging that we've done something wrong. And there's different kinds of guilt. There's false guilt. You feel guilty because of something that you've done, but really you aren't. You feel bad about something that maybe you didn't do or it wasn't really that big of a deal. But we're not talking about that today. The guilt that we're talking about today is the guilt associated with truly being guilty. You did something wrong, you hurt someone, you did someone wrong, and over time, if you're not careful, what you did in the past begins to define you. Then there's the guilt that is real because we did something, but we don't feel it. It's just so terrifying that we stuff it down. We know that we're guilty, and every now and then it just bubbles up inside of us. It makes us retreat to the narrative that we create that allows us to carry our guilt without it overwhelming us. And we all have a narrative, and it sounds something like this. It wasn't just me. They participated too. I was only 18, or I was only in my 20s. It was the 70s, it was the 80s, it was the 90s. It was just a different time in life. I was a college freshman. It was my first job. I didn't know any better. My dad was that way. My grandpa taught me that. Yes, I'm guilty. Yes, I did it. But we create a narrative that allows us to distance ourselves, a story that allows us to get away from our actual guilt. But here's why we need to talk about this. Denying it or being defined by it just empowers it. And when this happens in a relationship that is really important to us, guilt becomes the boss of us. And here's why that happens. It's because guilt creates a debt versus debtor, a debt over debtor relationship. And debt over debtor relationships, whether they're between us and ourselves or us and other people, like they are every single wrong that we've ever committed against another person. And in those things, like there's a sense that we took something from them. And because we took something from them, whether it's mental, psychological, physical, emotional, we feel like we owe them. That's the debt-debtor relationship. We even created terminology for this because we'll say things like, I owe her an apology, or like, I don't know how I will ever make it up to them. I took something and now I need to give it back. But I can't give time, I can't give life, I can't give self-esteem, dignity, I can't give their spouse back to them. Here's the trick that makes all this really difficult. We don't really experience guilt as debt. We don't understand it in that way. We experience guilt as a weight that throws us off balance. In fact, some of you, because of unresolved guilt, you're off balance in your parenting, you overparent, or you're a permissive parent because you're responding to something in your past. Maybe you're too aggressive in relationships. Maybe you're too timid in relationships. You struggle to forgive. You struggle to fully love. You're off balance because of this debt-debtor relationship. And we experience this as a weight, as really an unnecessary weight that throws us off balance. In our relationship to ourselves and with other people, again, we have terminology for this. When we finally resolve the guilt, we say things like, I feel like a weight has been lifted off of me. Here's the other thing about guilt. We carry the weight everywhere we go. You may have picked up your weight at work, but you brought it home. You may have picked up your guilt weight in college, but you took it on into the next season of your life. You may have picked up the weight of guilt on a trip, but you brought it back home. You may have gotten this weight as a child, but it carried with you through time and into every relationship you've had ever since then. Our guilt weight travels with us, and if we don't resolve it, guilt evolves into something very, very different, something scary. Guilt evolves into anger. And at the end of the day, you're angry with yourself, I'm angry with myself because we did not live up to our own expectations. And the problem with anger is that anger leaks. You're disappointed in you, but now you're constantly disappointed with the people that you're closest to. We didn't live up to our own expectations, and now nobody else can live up to our expectations. And there's a really good reason why we don't want to face or embrace our guilt. Because to face and to embrace it leaves us with no course of action. It leaves us standing condemned. There's no way to go back and undo the past. We can't go back and be freshmen again. We can't be unfaithful from that first marriage. We can't fix that childhood that we ruined for someone else. We can't undrink too much. We can't unwork too much. We can't return the joy of someone's life. We just can't do it. So again, we create a narrative, we create a story, and we try to move on, except that doesn't work either because our past wasn't designed to be left behind. It's our story. And as much as we want to distance ourselves from it, if we don't resolve it, it just travels with us. Now here's the great news. Because I know I've been a super huge bummer up until this point. You do not have to be defined by your past. You don't have to spend your life denying your past either. There is another option that Jesus offered. And Paul, who experienced this other option, he's the one that put it best. Now, when I read this, if you grew up in the church, please don't hear me reading the Bible. If you didn't grow up in the church and don't have much use for the Bible, I definitely don't want you to hear me reading the Bible. I want you to listen to this as the words of a man that had more regret than all of us combined. He had more guilt than we could ever imagine. What he's writing isn't in theory. He's not doing like television evangelist speak here. He wasn't just spitballing even about, what would be good things that I could write in this future Bible? This is a man whose life experiences left him broken and ashamed and feeling guilty. And here's the amazing thing. He didn't deny it. He actually documented it for us. We know his story because he wrote it all down for us, completely unfiltered. But instead of allowing it to define him or being consumed by trying to deny it, when he became a follower of Jesus, he discovered this other option that we're going to talk about today. So here's what he wrote. Romans 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation. Basically, as a result of something God has done, there is something new. There's a place where our past isn't forgiven, nor is it condemning. It can be faced, even though it can't be erased. It can be embraced, and we can live without condemnation. We no longer have to pretend that it didn't happen. We don't have to continue this narrative that gives us excuses. We can face it, but not feel the terrifying consequences of condemnation, self-condemnation, or condemnation from God. Where is this place? Well, he tells us, for those who are in Christ Jesus. Those who are willing to face the condemning truth about themselves, to then acknowledge it to God, and to surrender to the lordship, which is a really big word of saying like that there is a new boss, and it is his son Jesus. That they then stand uncondemned and are able to regain their balance. And why is this true? Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit, or basically through a relationship with Jesus, embracing everything that God through Jesus has done for us, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set us free from the law of sin and death. We are set free from the law of sin and death, and that is simply this, like when you hurt someone, you're guilty. And you're guilty forever, and you're just stuck. And there's nothing you can do. You can either sit in it, or you can try to deny it, or write a story, or do whatever, but ultimately you're stuck in it. And guilt becomes the boss of you. But the law of the Spirit of life has set you free from that law. And how? Because what the law was powerless to do, and the law that he's talking about is the Jewish law, but this could be your personal rules of behavior, what you think you should or shouldn't do, or what you were taught that you should or shouldn't do. Even you could put in here federal or municipal laws, because all of these laws can only set a standard as low as we can possibly go. And once we dip below that, it condemns us and it punishes us. And the law can't restore you or set you free. The law is just a constant reminder of what you did. And good luck with that. You know, you can deny it, you can come up with a story, but it's still there for the rest of your life. And it keeps us off balance constantly. And Paul discovered that when Jesus came, it created a different relationship with God. That God, through Jesus, did something that even the best law in the world can't do. What the law was powerless to do, God did. And how? He did it by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. He sent his Son, not guilty of anything, in the form of sinful flesh to take on him what we deserve so that we could be free, not trapped in either facing it or being defined by it or denying it and living a lie, to be a sin offering. That at the cross, Jesus took what we actually deserved on him. Jesus didn't just take your sin. He took the condemnation associated with your sin too. The divine condemnation, the community condemnation from people around us, and most importantly, this self-condemnation that we put on ourselves all the time. And when Paul recognized this, he said, when you step into and receive what God has done for you in Christ, there's no condemnation. There's no stories. There's no excuses. There's no blaming. And together we believe with Jesus that we are guilty, but we're not condemned. God says, when I see you, I don't see that. And I don't want you to see it either. I want you to see you the way that I see you. And it doesn't end just with us. I want you, God says, I want you to see her and him and them the way that I see them. And then he finishes with this, Paul does. And so he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us. You see, God condemned something, but it wasn't you, and it wasn't me. This means God has restored us to guiltless relationship with him in spite of our actual guilt. God chooses to love, relate, and listen to us as if it never happened. We're guilty because we did it, but we're not condemned because Jesus took the guilt on himself. Now, is this just a bunch of Christianese junk, Maybe you've been struggling to keep up or even grasp what I've just been talking about. But listen, what you need to know is this is a really big deal for us all. And because this is true, when we step into this relationship with Jesus that anyone can take advantage of, there are 4 things that happen. Number one, you forfeit the right to condemn yourself because you are not yours to condemn. Guilt is not the boss of you, but you aren't the boss of you either. You have a brand new boss, and your boss says you are not condemned. So you can tell that voice of shame, yes, I'm guilty, and I've been thinking about this guilt that I have the entire time that John's been talking, but I'm not condemned by God or by myself. I've been purchased with a price, Jesus' death, and I'm not my own. Number two, your guilt will remind you, but not define you. Yeah, you did it, but you are not what you did. God condemned sin, not you. And I hope that we can all get here, because I know for me, I didn't grow up this way. And it's been a long personal process of understanding for me to get here today. And listen, this isn't a you thing for me. This is an us thing. We're in this together. Think about this for me. I stand here week after week talking about how we should live our lives. So when my past comes up, imagine how big and ugly it can get, especially compared with what I do for a living. Your past, your guilt, your worst sin, your worst day, that worst spring break moment, or just the worst moment of your life becomes a pivot point for you. Not to condemn yourself, but to look up in gratitude to Jesus. And this is why Jesus said that the person who is forgiven the most should love the most. The more that you're forgiven, the more you have in your past to be embarrassed of, the more you try to deny, the more that there is, the greater is your capacity to love, and the greater your capacity to be grateful. That's why if you've ever been in a church service and there's a song playing and someone has their hands raised and they're weeping, crying, I guarantee you that that person has a story, and a lyric of that song reminded them of that story, and ultimately that they are forgiven. Because our past is a pivot point to look up and express gratitude. Number three, you forfeit the right to condemn others because that would just make you a hypocrite. When you get this, you give up the right to size people up and write them off. My experience has been that the more judgmental you are, the more judgmental that I am, the less aware we are of our own sin. And again, I know this because I spent so many years of my life right here just being super judgmental of people and not realizing my own sin, my own life, my own downfalls. And in fact, the more judgmental that a person is, the more likely they are to have some kind of big sin that they've created a narrative for, and all that guilt that they've never faced up to. It's just focused someplace else. Because people who confront, embrace, and face their past, they find it almost impossible to judge or condemn someone else. When you get this, when I get this, we are perfectly positioned to love the unlovable and forgive the unforgivable. That one idea changed the world once. It can do it again. And the last thing is this. You are free to make restitution without expectations and without excuses. Christianity is not, I hurt you, I betrayed you, I wronged you, and then I went home and I asked God to forgive me and now everything is good. That's not Christianity. That's something else. I don't know what it is, but that's not Christianity. Christianity is I hurt you, I faced my guilt, I asked God to forgive me, and He gave me what I didn't deserve, so the least I can do is to come back to you and give you what you deserve, an apology, seeking forgiveness from you. As a follower of Christ, not just a cultural Christian, your main directive is to love as you have been loved. And when we go back to people, not with excuses or stories, but to make restitution, to make up for it because of what God did for us, your willingness to go back and apologize and to seek forgiveness and healing from a person in your past, it may unlock a vault of bitterness inside of them that has been eating them alive. To look at life and to say, I did it and I'm guilty, but I'm forgiven and not condemned by God or myself. And, now I'm free to go back and make restitution for the things I did. And I'm not making excuses. I'm not writing stories. I'm not even saying, you had your part to play in this thing, or I was just really young and I'm, sorry, making an excuse. Our humility in these places, it may allow a person to begin to deal with stuff in their own hearts that they never knew what to do with. So I hate to ask you this. but maybe ultimately this is why you're watching today. Is there someone waiting for you to make the first move? Is there someone in your past and they're carrying around the shrapnel of what you did to them or did around them or, didn't do for them? If you're not a follower of Jesus, let me encourage you, this is a really healthy habit to think back through your life and to keep kind of short accounts with people. If you're a follower of Christ, this is the standard. This is what we do. This is what God commands of us because this is what He did for us. And listen, these people that we're talking about, they might not really be thinking about it. They've maybe even written you off. They think you've moved on, that you're successful, you got remarried, you live in a new state, you got a new job. They think that it hasn't bothered you at all. But inside, they are churning. Is there someone waiting on you to make the first move? And is your pride keeping you from making the first move? Is pride maybe the boss of you? See, Jesus humbled Himself for you. Now you are free, those of us who are followers of Jesus, to humble ourselves for others. When we fear the consequences of confronting, more than the consequences of concealing, we're making a huge mistake. Because this makes shame and guilt and denial the boss of us. We need, beginning today, to start saying, my past will remind me, but it will not define me. To learn more about the relationship with Jesus that I just talked about, or maybe to take steps towards this being true about your relationship with Jesus, I want to encourage you to join us at 4 p.m. on Sundays at Delco Park for the rest of August. And then tune in next week for part 3 of You're Not the Boss. Let me pray as we wrap up. Thank you, Jesus, that because of you, we can live a life where our past reminds us but doesn't define us. And I pray that you will make that more true about us every